Hello everybody, welcome to Pacific Northwest History. My name is Mr. Westerhoff, and this is going to be my final lesson and video for you guys for this school year. And it's on a very interesting topic. I'm going to be talking about both the Modoc War and the Nez Perce Retreat. These are the last battles that are fought in the period of Pacific Northwest history known as the Indian Wars. And so let's talk about what happened and some of the interesting results of both of these stories. So the Modoc War is going to be the first one that we're going to talk about. It takes place from 1864 to 1873. 1864, if you remember, is kind of near the end of the United States Civil War. So while that's happening over on the East Coast, this is happening over on the West Coast, near the southern border of the Pacific Northwest. Because we were talking about the Modoc tribe, who live in this interesting area along the Oregon and California border. Kind of around the area that we know today as Klamath Falls, also near Crater Lake, and this interesting area called the lava beds, which is kind of formed in this kind of rocky terrain over by Crater Lake and Lake Klamath as well. The Modocs were living along this area, and their longtime rival had been the Klamath people. So basically, they were rivals for a very long time. They were constantly fighting, and the United States decided to move the Modocs over to the Klamath Reservation, despite the two tribes being bitter enemies. So basically the Modoc decide, forget it, we're not going to move over there, we're not going to live next to our longtime enemies. So they decide to go back to their ancestral homeland in this lava bed area and decide to fight against the United States. So they would basically decided it was better to fight to the death than to be moved and told where to live. The leaders of the Modoc had some very interesting names, which is why I have a picture of Captain Jack Sparrow there. Their chief was actually named Captain Jack, and that's him there on the right. They also had some high-ranking members of the tribe known as Scarface Charlie and Shack Nasty Jim. I can just imagine that those guys were pretty tough with names like that. So what happens is that the Modocs actually kind of live in their ancestral land and fight off anybody trying to come in, whether it's settlers or the army, for the next 9 years. Eventually, Captain Jack kills a U.S. Army general in 1873, and this is where the United States government says, okay, enough of this. They're going to send a large army led by Civil War veterans over to this area of Northern California and Southern Oregon and finally just defeat the Modocs and solve this problem once and for all. So a large army is sent in and Captain Jack is executed, and this is the end of the Modocs' rebellion against the United States. Some of this brings to mind some other things that you'll learn throughout history class, which is what happens when kind of these tribal people, or these people in smaller, less settled societies, come up against like a big imperial power with really good technology and organization. And this has happened countless times throughout history. One of the most famous examples is actually in the Roman Empire. When the Roman Empire was expanding, they were kind of gobbling up and eating all these kind of smaller tribes as they were expanding their influence around the Mediterranean. One of the most famous examples being Caesar and his conquest of Gaul in what is now France, but at the time was known as Gaul, and these Gallic tribes, decided to fight back against Caesar and against the Romans. And so when you think about what's happening here at the United States, going further and further westward and kind of conquering this territory and tribe along the way, it kind of brings up those same feelings and those same, ideas that had happened before with places like Rome and the Roman Empire, which is, if you're one of these tribes, it's like you have two options. You can either stand and fight and, possibly your whole culture gets wiped out, or you can decide to work with the larger imperial power and protect your people the best you can. And it really is a tough and difficult situation. So why do I bring this up? Well, it's important to our next story, especially with the Nez Perce tribe. We have this whole green area, which used to be the land that was given to them in the Walla Walla Council back in 1855. This whole green area, as you can see, it's quite expansive. Goes all the way through this area of Idaho, through Oregon here, even parts of eastern Washington. And then you can see the smaller orange wedge right here. So the difference between these two is striking. What's going to happen is that over time, this area that was given to the Nez Perce tribe before is going to be, put down into this orange category instead. So we're going to talk about what happens and why that happened. The Nez Perce had been the most peaceful tribe to the white settlers for many, many years at this point. They even protected Governor Stevens at the Walla Walla Council, and because of this, they were given the most generous land as part of that treaty. In 1877, though, Chief Joseph, who was the leader of the Nez Perce, he was ordered to move his tribe to a much smaller reservation. So they were used to having all this land in green, and they were told to move to the area in orange, basically, cutting off all this area that they were used to living in. This was because settlers had been constantly trespassing on Nez Perce land for timber and gold. Gold was found here in the Snake River, and this led a lot of people to end up wanting this area of Nez Perce land. So, of course, the tribe was not happy about having to give up so much land, and this led to conflict. Many of Chief Joseph's warriors refused to move at all, and they killed 4 of the settlers. After this happens, the U.S. Army feels like they have to retaliate and move the entire tribe forcefully to the new location. So what happens is that Joseph decides, okay, instead of doing that, we are going to retreat and go up to Canada, where the army can no longer bother us anymore. We'll have asylum in Canada, and the United States won't be able to bother us anymore. So he leads the entire tribe of 2,900 people. I actually had to stop this video and look up to make sure I was getting the number right. So it was 2,900 people. Think of the entire tribe, men, women, children. The entire tribe is moving with Chief Joseph across the United States and trying to escape to Canada. The idea was that they would meet up with another famous Indian leader at this time named Sitting Bull, who was famous for his participation in the Battle of Little Bighorn and Custer's Last Stand. Basically, they knew if they could meet up with him, they would be safe. They were pursued by over 2,000 U.S. troops. So we have 2,000 U.S. troops chasing almost 3,000 of the Indian tribe. So this is a very dramatic journey. As you can see here, this lasts from June to October of the year 1877. So you can see here, this is a map of the United States. So you can see that the entire tribe moved this way, moved down across the over the Rocky Mountains here, went through what is now Yellowstone National Park, went up north through Montana, and they were trying to get here to Chief Sitting Bull's camp. So this is where they tried to get to. However, they were cut off right here at a place called Paw Mountain, because the United States had a second army that kind of left from a fort over here and actually cut them off. But to get there was a whole very interesting story. So they ended up winning 4 battles. The Nez Perce actually won 4 battles against the army that was chasing them, and it was over 1,300 miles. You can only imagine, in thousands of people, chasing thousands of more people 1,300 miles. So you can only imagine what that would look like. Joseph was finally defeated at Paw Mountain, which I showed you before, in Montana. This was 30 miles away from the Canadian border. The United States, after capturing Joseph and the tribe, decide that for their crimes, and their crimes against the United States, they're not going to be moved back to their original ancestral homeland back here. because yeah, they were over like here at the time. So what happened was that they were actually told to move to Oklahoma, which is of course thousands of miles away. So this was the way to punish the Nez Perce for what they had done for defying the orders of the United States government. However, after about 8 years, this was seen as unnecessarily cruel as a punishment, so a lot of the Nez Perce were allowed to return to the Pacific Northwest in the Colville Reservation, which was that smaller area I showed you guys before. Chief Joseph ends up dying in the year 1904, and I have a quote from him, which is in your book. So if you have your book, open up to page 215. This is after the Battle of Paw Mountain and what he said. And this is a direct quote. So if you have your book, you can open it up to page 215 and read along. It says, "Tell General Howard I know his heart. I know what he told me before I have in my heart. I have tired of fighting. Our chiefs are killed. Looking Glass is dead. The old men are all killed. It is the young men who say yes or no. He who led the young men is dead. It is cold, and we have no blankets. The little children are freezing to death. My people, some of them, have run away to the hills, and have no blankets, no food. No one knows where they are, perhaps freezing to death. I want time to look for my children and see how many of them I can find. Maybe I shall find them among the dead. Hear me, my chiefs, I am tired. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." Eventually, that was after the Battle of Paw Mountain, where Chief Joseph surrendered, because many people in part of the retreat had run off on their own in the cold in the cold of Montana, around October, and he said, "It's better that I surrender here. I'm done with fighting, as opposed to fighting more and having more of his people die." So this is kind of the end of the era, the end of the hostilities between the Indian tribes and the United States government in the Pacific Northwest. This is really the end of all of that. To this day, there are 272,000 Native Americans that live in the Pacific Northwest, mostly still on the reservations that were established in 1855. And they are the descendants of the people who survived this whole era of history and survived the era of the disease that had wiped out a lot of their tribe. So still, still a lot of history there. Still, something that affects us to this day, especially in the Pacific Northwest, where I'm teaching right now, very close to the Yakima Reservation. So these are all important details of history. It's important for us to always remember and think about for the future as well. So thank you guys for learning with me, because I didn't know a lot about this when I moved here. I grew up in the Bay Area of California. So this is a lot of this with Pacific Northwest and learning about the Indian tribes and that sort of thing has been new to me as well. So I very much enjoyed learning about it. There's a lot of amazing history out there for each one of these tribes and each part of America, because I was not very much I didn't know much about Pacific Northwest geography or culture, or how things are in the valley and like the history of irrigation and even that kind of stuff. And there's thousands, if not millions, of these stories across the United States and across the world, that every culture has such a unique background. And it's really what I love about history. So thank you guys for joining me this year. If you are in my freshman class, next year we'll have world history, and boy, that's a lot of fun. So I can't wait to see you guys then. Thank you for joining me today. Bye-bye.